He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 25 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back, Henry, and today we have a special guest all the way from the United Kingdom, Charles Wigley, who has been for the past 25 years or so a strategist with BBH, first in Asia and then in the UK. And we've talked about him before because he wrote a blog post on BBH Labs blog that I think is called Chaz's 100 Things a Planner Should Know. So we pummeled or plummeted, is it plummeted? I guess the word is plummeted, plumbed. We grabbed some good stuff from his blog post and talked about them in 2 episodes. But we decided we were going to invite him to be a guest, and we had a great conversation. And let's go to that right now. All right, Henry, it's great to be back with another episode, and we are joined today by a special guest from London. Are you in London now, Charles?
I'm in the middle of the countryside.
You're in the middle of the countryside, but you're in England.
I am in England.
Okay, he's in England. Charles Wigley is our guest today. He is the author of a blog post whose 100 points we have pummeled for 2 episodes of the Brief Brothers. And Henry and I decided it would be great if we could get him to join us on an episode of the Brief Brothers, and he has graciously agreed to give us some of his time here on a Friday afternoon. Charles, I'm going to turn it over to you to let you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background, and then I'm going to jump in and kind of set up our conversation. So thank you for joining us, Charles. We're glad to have you.
Yeah, pleasure, Howard. Henry, good to see you both. My name's Charles. I'm essentially a very old planner, guys. I've got lots of grey hair and small specs, and I've been doing this far too long. I started my career at BBH in London in the late 80s. Then I had a kind of travel bug, traveled around the world, ended up working in Asia, in Hong Kong for a couple of years. Then I moved to Australia, worked there for 6 years, and then returned to Asia and rejoined BBH, where I've been, I was for the last 20 years, up until mid last year, basically. And there I was basically planning director and then chairman of the Singapore office. And then as we grew, I became chairman of the region for BBH. But fundamentally, always normally doing roughly the same thing, which is the old planner stuff, the strategy on the big accounts, helping have conversations with clients, brand owners about the overall direction their brand and their work should go. So that's me.
Well, that's great. And we really appreciate you being here. So I wanted to start off our conversation by letting our viewers, all 50 or 60 of them, I think we're really growing now. And by the way, with your presence here, I think we might double that.
Well, that's good.
Yes. Well, as I said, we found your blog post where you listed 100 things that every planner should know. And each of us picked 3 or 4 and talked about them. And we did this over 2 episodes. And prior to this episode, you asked us to pick 3 or 4 more each. And we're going to try to address as many of those as we can. But before we get into that conversation, and we were talking about this before we started recording, your colleague, Dave Trott, gave a talk online fairly recently, a 40-minute talk in which he outlined the golden age of advertising. And he had a demarcation point in the early 60s with some Volkswagen ads. And then his argument essentially became there are essentially 2 reasons why he believes creativity in advertising has deteriorated or been diminished. First, because we no longer talk to our customers as adults. Primarily, he says, because 1, we've relied too much on computer gimmicks, CGI tricks, the new bells and whistles. And that has become a substitute for an idea. And the second cause he identified was the advent of account planning, which emerged essentially in the 60s in the UK from great minds like Stanley Pollitt and Stephen King. He argued that creatives used to be the ones who held the domain around insights and propositions and research. And when that was removed from the creative department, that meant a decline in creativity. So before we get to your great points in your blog post, I wanted to get your thoughts on Dave Trott's argument and hear what you had to say. Because Henry and I had a great episode on that. What are some of your thoughts, Charles?
Well, first, I vaguely know Dave, actually, and he's a great guy. He's a great contrarian, and I'm not at all surprised he said what he said. I mean, not at all. But he kind of says one thing and sometimes does another. I mean, I've had him in to talk to the BBH Global Planning Group, and he happily gave us an afternoon of his time. I mean, he lectured us a bit, but he happily did that. He was also enormously positive around the 100 Things list. He promoted it. He put me in touch with publishers. So Dave has a slightly schizophrenic approach when it comes to planning and planners. I think the point he makes, though, has some validity in terms of, I mean, he's also a great strategist, by the way. So a lot of the stuff in the list I put together is strategy from Dave Trott, and I've cited where I've taken bits from him. And when I mean, I've been doing this so damn long. When I started out, especially went to Asia and some of the senior creative people there, they'd never had a planner before. So invariably, it was the copywriter, the senior copywriter, who had to do the strategy. And they're very good minds. Some of the people I worked with early on were excellent strategists. So the notion that somehow strategy should be confined to the planning department, I think, is wrong anyway. And I've always thought that everybody can contribute to it. I think the other thing he's citing is over complexity. I mean, the essence of great planning is to do smart things that really help brands move on and help advertising creative move on, but which are focused and simple. And there is too much planning out there that creates documents and fluff and verbiage and doesn't necessarily cut to the chase. Also doesn't necessarily get to the fundamentals of planning. I'm afraid that it's quite tempting, especially amongst younger planners, to try and be the creative person. I mean, I've always said to the departments I've been involved with and run, that's not helpful. We have a creative department. What we need the strategy department to do, and maybe it should be called strategy rather than planning, is work out with the clients the fundamentals of what we want to do with the brand. What are the issues it faces? Who are its core audiences? And then from that, develop a comms strategy. Actually, you know, using Dave's words again, which I absolutely agree with. He always says, you know, give me dull words and clever thinking, not clever words and dull thinking. And he's right. So too much complexity, too much verbiage, agreed, and too much putting beautifully written things in place of really interesting strategy. I think he's right on those things. On the other hand, he's like anybody. Equally, if he sees a good brief and he sees a good piece of thinking, going to latch onto it straight away wherever it came from. So he's a bright guy, and like all people, like, you know, they'll take the stimulus and the ideas from where they can get them.
I think one of the counter arguments that I make, and I've made it on the podcast a lot of times, is this idea that planning is monolithic. Just because you have a planner doesn't mean you have a good planner, right? Like, I mean, there's a lot of people in the industry at all levels, and creative and account service and planning, and it's a bell curve of talent, right? There's some really outstanding, most are adequate, and some are horrible. So just because you have a planning department doesn't mean you have a good planning department. So I think that, and honestly, I think one of the things that belies the idea that account planning, the advent of account planning, helped kill creativity is some of the best campaigns came from those, you know, 60s, 70s agencies in London that were actively engaged in account planning. So
I think there's a couple of other points as well, which Dave hasn't taken into account, and I can see from his point of view why he wouldn't. Well, maybe one of them, I think he would. I think one of the things that happened, one of the inflection points about why planning came about in the late 60s and the 70s, was that society was changing. It was becoming far more diverse. There were more, you know, there were teenagers being created in the late 50s and the 60s and come across from America as a nation. You know, you didn't have to grow up that young. There were immigrant groups. There were breakdowns in some of the class structures in the UK. Society wasn't as clearly and easy to understand as it was in the past. So planning came in because society was becoming more fragmented and it was harder to understand people. It's interesting, if you look at some markets, very advanced like Japan, I've done a lot of work in Japan, account planning hasn't really ever taken off in the way we would understand it in terms of strategy there. And then you look at Japanese society, it is incredibly monolithic, actually. It is very homogeneous. It is 99% or 98% Japanese, and everybody goes through the same school system, reads the same books, watches the same TV. So again, I wonder if planning never really took root there, because actually everybody in that room, client or agency, already knows the consumer. I think the other point that Dave misses is the pressure on clients. In the past, agencies had a lot more time to work on things. They were given more time. So you could be a writer and do your own research and get out there and do all of that. Quite often, creative departments are under such pressure now that they can't do all of that. So,
Charles, how much of that is our own fault?
I think an awful lot of it is our own fault. And there's no getting away from that, Howard. You know.
Yeah, I mean, every agency is racing to say, yes, we'll do it. We want your business. The client gives you an impossible deadline and you bend over backwards to make it, and you set that precedent, and next time you have to do it. Well, you did it last time in 2 weeks, do it. And so it's a vicious cycle, just like the race to zero profit margin, right? Like we're all undercutting each other. We've made creative a time commodity, like a lawyer, right? Where we bill for hours. And it's okay. So the next guy is willing to do it for 10% less. And nobody thinks about, well, what quality of work am I getting for that 10% less?
Yeah, I was super interested. I was just reading an article just half an hour ago here. And in a survey, it says that it was client contentedness score. Clients have never been happier. Agency people have never been unhappier. And you go, right, okay, guys, I think there's a bit of an issue.
Well, you know, that's like ANA does the Association of National Advertisers, which is our big trade group out here in New York. I don't know what the equivalent is in the UK. I know you've got you have a number of established organizations.
Yeah.
They do surveys every year or often about agency and client attitudes toward the creative brief. And we've talked about that on some of our episodes, where the clients say the agencies don't get us, and the agencies say, well, the clients don't understand what this is all about. So it's a communication gap between the two primary players about what this document is supposed to be.
I think you raise an interesting point there. I mean, I think, have you read Madison Avenue Manslaughter, by the way?
No.
You should read that, guys. It was written by a guy who was a finance director for one of the big groups. And in it, in a quantitative way, he works out the extra pressure that people have been under in agencies over the last 20 years. And he says, on average, a creative team now is asked to do 3 times the work in the same time as it ever was in the 80s, basically. And so that's the level of pressure. So each team does 3 times the output. You can of course, there's a quality drop going on there. Inevitably, there is.
Right.
But there's also this issue that I think one of the points that you raised, Henry, in some of my jottings, were that notion of taking the time out to build bridges between clients and agencies and actually discuss work. I mean, too often, agencies only discuss work when they're trying to sell it, which is about 5 weeks too late. So, I mean, I've always said that one of the first things an agency team has to do, and actually I think account management has a very big responsibility here, and creative directors, which is we are going to talk one-to-one with the client about work. We'll take a reel in, we'll take some, posts in, and none of it will be our work, none of it will be the client's work, and we will just talk about what they like, what they don't like, what we don't like, just to start to build bridges. It's that Paul Arden thing about each of us has a different definition of creativity, and that's kind of fine.
Yeah, I
understand that.
I put that as one of the ones that I wanted to talk to you about today. Specifically, was number 47 on your list. Understand your client's definition of creativity. Maybe different from your own. Thank you, Paul Arden. And honestly, I think that this is one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue, between client and agency relationships. From what I've seen in my 25-year career, is that you do a pitch, you show this work, you make a lot of assumptions about what the client thinks about creativity. You get hired, and you never really have that conversation where they say, well, this is where we believe the role of creativity is for this brand, and this is what we think about commercials that make a lot of noise in them, whatever that philosophy is. And there's no right or wrong. There's just what your client believes and what you believe. And if you're not having that explicit conversation so that expectations are set, then you're going to be destined to have mismatches, right? Like, you're going to present ideas and they're going to say, you don't get the brand. You don't, and it's not that you don't get the brand, it's that you don't get their philosophy on creativity. And I don't know why it's so taboo to have the CMO sit down with the strategists and the creatives and the account people from the agency and say, have a meeting of the minds. And by the way, I also don't think that conversation is happening internally at the client either. I don't think the CMOs are doing a good job of communicating down to the mid-level decision makers, like, here's the vision.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there is a kind of slight, you're right, that it's a fear of talking to the client about work, but you've got to overcome it.
I think there's an even more fundamental issue beneath that, and that is I don't think there's an understanding on the part of clients how an idea emerges.
I think
I mean, there was a debate, a mini debate I saw on LinkedIn just the other day, where someone posted a question about, well, as a copywriter, the person was a copywriter making the post. As a copywriter, I often get the question, "You're the word guy. Come up with an idea." And his response was, "Okay, well, I'm going to need a couple of days to think about this. I'm not a magician. I can't just pull something out of my hat." Because it revealed to the copywriter that the person asking the question doesn't know how how someone arrives at an idea. It just doesn't happen. Now, I was a copywriter for 26 years. I could come up with an idea a hell of a lot faster in the last couple of years of my career than I could in the first couple of years of my career, because I knew how to do it. And maybe I could have come up with an idea like that, but that's not the point. It's just an ignorance about, well, how does creativity even work? Much less, what is your philosophy of creativity? But how does it work?
But I think here again that people will never know unless they experience it themselves. I mean, again, I think it's probably down to us as strategists and creatives and agency people to train our clients. And I remember there used to be courses that certainly BBH used to run for clients where they'd come along and, we'd do role play. And then the agency people would have to go and learn about the stuff, the marketing stuff that the client were doing. But again, that takes time, that takes investment. I mean, there's nothing like getting a client team to write a brief and then write some ads and then present them to everybody for them all of a sudden to go, oh, hang on, this is a bit trickier. And likewise, there's nothing like agency people going into a client organization to realize that, the ad bit is probably 10% of their job and they better get pricing and distribution in Walmart pretty quickly. So it's just one of those things that, again, it's about investment of time.
Let me address one of the points. I kind of went to the very bottom of your list because I don't think I had gotten that far. I'd read the whole list, of course, and then when Henry and I started picking out our favorites, I started at the top, so I'm going to start at the bottom. I love number 94.
Right.
94, the simplest brief, get, fill in the blank, audience and problem, 2, action you require, by your strategy here. So I had a caveat. I said, but can you show us? And I'm not going to ask you to produce a brief for us right now, but
just give me a minute. Okay, Howard, just one.
But can you show us one of these briefs? I roll my eyes every time I see someone on LinkedIn post his or her brilliant, shiny new creative brief template. I don't care about a template. I want to see a shiny. I mean, it's Dave Trott's show me dull words and a brilliant idea, but I want to see brilliant writing because that's really the hard part. I see templates all the time, but no one wants to share a finished brief that they believe is brilliant. That's hard.
It's hard and because it puts them on the spot as well. We ask creative people to cover the wall and stuff, and we all stand there and pontificate. But maybe planners need to come up with a few options as well and put them on the wall. Which actually, when you do that, works enormously well because you then get the group discussing everything and go, "Oh, we like that one." And then when you present that one, everybody's already emotionally invested. So it's a very simple trick for planners, especially young ones, to just get people involved in the process with you. this notion that people have to do things on their own, I think, is very antiquated. You have to do it, but then pull people in to comment and challenge and criticize, and you'll push your thinking on.
Henry and I talked about this. Go ahead.
Yeah, just on the get to, but actually we were talking about Julian Cole's Planning Dirty. He's done one on get to buy, and that's worth people who want to see. Oh, he's done one really good post-rationalized, one really good example there. That's a nice one. He shows the work and then how it's done and stuff. I'm not sure as a briefing format, it's the best one to develop your thinking. I think it's a great thing to summarize your thinking.
Right.
You can really sum things up brutally quickly that way. Yeah, I had a great thing. It's quite good on politics and history. So I did one for World War II and Winston Churchill. Do you want to hear that one?
Yeah,
sure. Because, that's one of the things that I say a lot. A creative brief template is not just for brands. You could use the template.
Absolutely.
I used to anything.
This training session was, how would you get to persuade your grandma to come and watch The Shining with you? So then you had to kind of, you see. Yeah. But Jack's a good-looking boy. That's a start. Anyway, so Winston Churchill, what was his strategy to win the war, the World War II? So get the Allies, despite their problem being that at the onset of the conflict, they were vastly under-resourced compared to Nazi Germany, to beat Nazi Germany by, and what do you think the strategy was? So we can have a historical debate here.
Wow. Persuading FDR of the historical necessity of being an ally with Great Britain and Europe.
Totally. Get the US involved. He had one overarching strategy, which was get you lot on boats. And that was it. Everything else was speechifying and subsequent. And, it's as simple as that. That was his primary focus, because he knew the truth.
Yeah. And it is amazing that a man of no small ego could put that aside to persuade his colleague and friend to do just that.
Yeah. We've got to say the Russians helped.
I'm a big fan of Churchill. He was half American, of course. But I agree. But I think that there's a lot to criticize Churchill for, but I think that in terms of that moment of World War II, he was very clear thinking, and he understood that without the massive resources of the United States, that the Allies were just not going to be able to beat back the Nazis.
Boris Johnson was American as well, guys. I don't know if you want him back. It's just an offer we can make.
Who are you talking, Boris? Oh,
Boris Johnson had an American passport for most of his life.
I live in Texas, and we have a governor here who, but I can't go any further than that, or I'd be canceled. Yeah. So, but what I love about that, I do love the simplicity of your formula, and as a creative, I'm not at all opposed to talking about things like formulas, because one of the things I point to on how an idea emerges is the formula that was formulated by James Webb Young in his book, A Technique for Producing Ideas, which has been in print since the 40s.
Yeah.
So there is a formula. There are certain set rules you have to follow to come up with an idea. And if you break those rules, you're going to have a harder time arriving at that idea. So getting to a simple formula like get, what was it? Get to and why? Get to
by. It's a great summary, I think.
I'm gonna lightly object to what you just said, Howard. I don't think there are rules. I think there are tools, and I think that something like these formulas that they're tools that help you to kind of quickly get to the heart of the matter. It doesn't mean that you can't just have a good idea, or that you can't do some other process, or I don't think there's uniformity, but I think there are certainly tools and techniques that have been proven over time to be pretty effective.
Right. If you try to come up with an idea and you don't follow James Webb Young formula, you're not going to come up with an idea. It's just as simple as that. You have the brain. All he said was, after the fact, this is what the brain does to come up with an idea. And if you try to subvert that process, you're going to be out in the woods. You're going to have mush for brain, because
I need to read this now.
Oh, it's about 60 pages. So you can, you know, it's a good book for the loo.
That's ideal.
Yeah, but Henry and I don't disagree a lot, but sometimes we do, and this one we do. But Henry,
I wanted to go ahead.
no, I was going to say hit him up with your next question. Your next.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, you talked earlier about Japan, and that kind of leads into one of the other ones that I put on my list to talk to you about, which is the world is not becoming more westernized. And I'm curious about that because I work in the multicultural space here in the United States. I work in the U.S. Hispanic market. And so there's this tension between Latin American culture, right, that the immigrant brings to the United States, which is distinct from American culture. You know, for example, in Latin America, it's much more collectivist, interdependent, where America is all about rugged individualism. And so the immigrant and the immigrant's children and grandchildren are kind of blending these two competing worldviews, and that makes a very unique target audience. But I was wondering if this is a problem you see a lot in Asia, that people mistakenly have this belief that it's becoming more westernized. I think in the Hispanic market, one of the mischaracterizations, I think people think in 10 years, all Hispanics are going to be very Americanized. And I'm like, well, acculturation is neither linear nor fast from everything that I've seen. So what do you think?
It's an interesting question. I think Henry, I think to your question, I think it used to be a problem. I think 30 years ago it was. I think over time, though, far less of one. I think you actually have to look about how advertising developed around the world. So advertising agencies largely spread around the world from North America and the UK and Northern Europe as partners to their multinational clients. So think Procter & Gamble, think Unilever, think Shell, think British Petroleum, all of these. So they took methods and thinking and actually creative judgment, how they judge ideas, from North America, and then they spread it around the world. And that were a set of tools and rules to train people who came in, they recruited in. The problem is, though, it's an inherently westernized way of looking at advertising and the world, or a North American or a British way of looking at things, and it doesn't always help. Over the last 30 years, though, if you look at people who are running the agencies around the world, and predominantly now, as it should be, they're run by people from those cultures who instinctively understand that. So the work is far more relevant and really, has a lot of local insight embedded within it. So I think it was a problem in Asia. I don't think it is anywhere near as much anymore. I think the notion that somehow Cannes can judge all creativity in one fell swoop, though, and everybody wants to be a Cannes winner. Yeah, okay. I'd argue that Cannes still operates in a very westernized approach to what great creative work is. So you can still see it happening in some areas, but I think it's far less of a problem. Have you ever read, and I don't know if any of your listeners have ever read, one of the books I always recommend to people is one called The Geography of Thought.
This is we're like batting zero here with your book recommendations.
No, well, I hadn't read the classic about the origin of ideas.
James Webb Young.
He's
Webb. A Hall of Fame copywriter from the 1940s.
I need to grab that. So The Geography of Thought was written about a decade ago by a professor, I think he's at Harvard, called Nisbet. And his whole area of study has been about culture and how it affects how people see the world, which is fascinating from an advertising point of view. And his real area of focus is North Americans versus Asian societies. Now, inevitably, a lot of the sample groups he uses are his students at various universities around Asia and in the west coast of America, etc. But it's absolutely fascinating. It's well worth, reading that, because you get especially if you work in Asia, especially if you're a foreigner about to go and work in Asia, or a Westerner, because all of a sudden you go, okay, I understand. I mean, the other person who was brilliant around culture and its impact on, well, he wasn't operating in the world of advertising at all, but its impact on how people operate was Hofstede. Have you ever read any of the Hofstede stuff? It's a Dutch man called Geert Hofstede, and there's now a Hofstede Institute. And all his work came from IBM. because IBM had real problems around the world. You know, the Japanese hated the Koreans, probably for real. Well, the Koreans hated the Japanese. The Swedes wouldn't get on with the Italians. The Italians couldn't get on with the Mexicans. And they got him in as an anthropologist and a cultural expert. Explain why we can't get teams to work with each other. And he developed from this huge survey he did originally of IBM employees, I think they've broadened it out since, cultural differences. And he had 5 different cultural what would you call them? Kind of key dimensions. And one of them, to your point, Henry, was collectivism versus individualism. One is machismo cultures versus feminized cultures. Another is hierarchical cultures versus, you know, more equal cultures. Power distance, he called that. Another is entrepreneurial cultures versus, you know, it's fascinating stuff. And he always talks about, we all wear a pair of cultural lenses from, you know, as we grow up, our family situation, the school we go to, the TV we watch, but none of us realize we're wearing them. So everybody's wearing cultural spectacles. And, you know, that's how wars start. It's how conflict starts, because people just do not understand why that group of people over there are looking at the same thing as they are in a completely different manner. So it's well worth that cultural stuff. It's well worth.
Yeah, that's great. Bias, blindness.
Yeah.
We're all blind to our individual biases. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me jump into the next question from your list. I moved from the bottom, moving up, number 89. How did you arrive at the idea that our brains are not wired for creative thinking?
I didn't. I stole it. I stole it from an innovation company called What If, and I read what they wrote, and I can't remember the name of the book. And I thought, God, you're right. And the point they made was that to survive, we have so much stimulus coming into us the whole time as humans. We filter out most of it. It all operates subconsciously. To survive, we have to repeat patterns. But we then apply that to our working lives. So how do I develop a brief? Well, I've got a way of doing it. How do I develop an ad? I've got a way of doing it. And quite often, to solve problems in genuinely fresh ways, you have to jolt yourself out of that quite consciously and use methods to go, right, let's think about this from a different standpoint. And you kind of get that makes perfect sense, because it's very easy for us to hang on to the same kind of, follow the same path every single time. So that's where that comes from.
Okay, well, even though, let me just follow up, even though.
But it's also, sorry, just something on that, Howard. If you look at, and I've seen a study on this, I can't remember who did it. If you look at creativity, it declines as we grow older. No, I don't mean old, I mean from childhood to when you're in your early 20s. There is a massive decline. Because when you're a child, the whole world is fresh. You see things without the rules and constraints we layer on as we socialize children, as they go through the educational packaging process.
I would clarify that. I don't think creativity declines. I think our individual response to the stimulus we get affects how we see the world. In which we adults shut us down. I forget the guy's name, but he did a 19-minute TED talk on why schools kill creativity.
That's a really interesting British educationalist. He just recently died. I don't remember his name. He's absolutely brilliant.
And he delivered it without notes, without pausing, without a single slide. But the premise was, the I don't want to use the word formulaic, but the conformity that society imposes on children inhibits their creativity. So the creativity is there. It's just been shut down.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, Howard. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying we end up in situations where we follow the same patterns of behavior. And quite often we end up in organizations where they go, well, we do it this way here.
Yes.
And
exactly.
That's a dangerous place to be, because, well, why do we have to do it that way here? So, and this way here is often very similar to your competitors this way here.
And if you
the only way you're going to differentiate is to do it different here.
And if you question the why do we do it this way, you're branded a troublemaker and a contrarian. And
right. Even in an ad agency environment where creativity is supposed to be the foundation of everything that they do. I can recall stepping into a new agency and saying, well, I've done it this way. I did the creative brief this way. I did the blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, we don't do it that way. So why should we do it this way? So yeah, it's a common thing. I was listening to a podcast just this morning, and one of the premises was this whole idea of cultural pressure is not brought by governments or institutions. It's brought by us onto each other. It's peer pressure has more to do with keeping us quiet or exciting us to do something different than any other outside force. And we are that microcosm at an ad agency or at a client.
Yeah,
so, sure. Henry, get another question?
Cool. I think I have one more, and it was advertising in its current forms may well be a declining force, but brands and creativity won't be. Know where your future lies. And so my comment is, we're told all the time that advertising is dying. What's your opinion of where the future lies? I recently posted on LinkedIn. I said, they've been telling us Ad Age, Campaign, all of the trade publications have been telling us that advertising is dying for 20, 30 years. And right now you can't hire a copywriter or an art director because the market is so hot. So who's hiring all these creative people if advertising is dying?
Yeah, no, I don't think advertising's dying. And remember all those books about, 15 years ago? What was that one? The Death of the 30-Second Commercial. And I met the guy who wrote that, actually, very nice guy. But I don't think it's dying at all. And I also think there's a rebalancing with regard to the kind of obsession with digital everything. I think people are realizing, at different stages in the purchase funnel, where advertising and brand work plays its role, where retail work, where following through on the consumer journey, quite often online, plays its way. So I think things are getting back in balance, which I think is a very, very good thing. But having said that, you could also argue that we have a lot more tools at our disposal. And, the amount of money that goes into advertising is going up every year. But relative to the amount of money going into other things, advertising shares actually going down slightly every year. So money is being spread by clients to lots of other things. So there are many levers, many tools at our disposal. So the point I was making, and this is, I think it's easier for planners and strategists to do this than creatives, which is make sure that in your strategy, you're not just thinking about advertising. You're thinking about what the retailer will look like, how the CEO makes his or her speeches, what tone of voice should be, all of those elements. Don't just make it about the ad right now. You need to think about the bigger brand things. And also, I think you can extend your career as a strategist by not just being about ads. You can apply, as we were talking earlier, you can apply these structures and formulas to a whole range of communication problems. I think the challenge, and Howard, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think the challenge that creative people face is they not only have to master the thinking, they have to master the craft of specific mediums. So that takes time. You can't just do a TV commercial or a print you have to get practiced about it. Planning, in a sense, because it is slightly more abstract, it's about overall direction and specific, you can apply it to it's slightly easier. So that, if that makes sense, that was the point I was making, basically. I don't think advertising's dying, but it's becoming a smaller part of the whole, simple as that.
Are you familiar with the work of Bob Hoffman, the ad contrarian?
Yeah.
I think he would disagree with you. He thinks that the ad world, the advertising industry is, well, one of the points that he made that I think illustrates his thinking is, in the last 30 years, medicine has made tremendous advances. In the last 30 years, computers have made tremendous advances, TV, electronics, automobiles. But it's argued that in the last 30 years, advertising has gotten worse.
Yeah.
So if advertising isn't dying, but it's getting worse, where is it? Right.
Well, that wasn't the question, though, Howard. The question was, is advertising dying? If you look at the money, no, it's not.
No, it's not. But
is it getting worse in terms of quality? I would argue yes. I mean, interestingly, I think the quality in America now is a lot higher than the UK. Because if you look at the TV in the UK, this used to be a centre of excellence for brand work. Yes, it is now predominantly hard sell retail with jingles of an evening. versus, I think, the copywriter's art of humor, etc., in the US is stronger, and there's been a revival of that, which is great to see. And you look in Asia, and actually the quality of brand work's getting better every year. But yeah, overall, you could argue, yeah, the quality has, we talked about it earlier, has gone down overall. There's more money coming into it, but the quality is going down. I'm not quite sure where that gets us, though, Howard.
I agree. I think that for me, you mentioned something that was interesting to me, which was that in the UK, certain things are deteriorating, and in the United States, they're getting better, which to me gets to just something true in life, which is things are cyclical, right? There's a pendulum shift. There's a golden age, and then it declines, and then it comes back, and so I think that that's normal. That said, I think that a lot of the argument about creativity declining is also a little bit overblown. I think there's always a tendency to look back at some perceived golden age. We only think of the great commercials of the 60s and 70s. We don't remember any of the horrible commercials of the 60s and 70s. And there were plenty, and like I said before, there's a bell curve in these things, and so 20 years from now we'll remember some of the commercials from now as being excellent, and we will have just forgotten the ones that were irrelevant. And that kind of leads into my other point, which I try to tell clients all the time. Is like in the multicultural space, a lot of them are very fearful of making a mistake that will alienate consumers, and because the client is unfamiliar with the culture that we're advertising to, they're very risk averse. Yeah. And I tell them, look, the real danger isn't that you're going to offend somebody, because people don't think about brands that much to even be offended, right? The real danger is when people don't think about your brand at all. Like when you're in oblivion, and I think Dave Trott says it, right? He says there's something like 4% of advertising is remembered and appreciated, like 7%.
Hasn't he? Yeah.
7% is like remembered and hated, and like 80-something% is just not remembered at all. So it's just irrelevant. And to me, that's a bigger waste of money than actually producing a bad ad that people comment on.
Agreed. And I think your point about there was a lot of garbage around in the 70s and the 80s is a salutary and good point, Henry. I remember John Hegarty in the 80s. He actually made this point to TV sales companies here, the ad channel, said you should always put BBH ads on first, because actually you'll get people into the ad break, because the rest of the ads are all crap. I know they're all crap. You know them. That's a good hardcore sales pitch. Of course, that's a good work. That's a good yes.
That's a good selling point. Talking about like the kind of the golden age, we just had Cliff Freeman pass away.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about him because Howard and I are thinking about doing an episode on Cliff Freeman and what made his advertising magical. But I triggered that thought when we were talking about like the good ads versus the bad ads. And certainly a lot of those Cliff Freeman and Partners ads from the 80s are ones that really went viral before there was an internet, right? Like people would talk about them at the water cooler. And I think it converges with a lot of the things that Howard and I have been talking about, like Paul Feldwick's books about, advertising that entertains, or entertainment as a method of kind of subversively getting your advertising sales message into the minds of consumers, or either passively or in some other way, but and I think it's apocryphal, right? That we all still remember Where's the Beef and those great ads.
I think it's an interesting point that Feldwick makes, though, because I mean, you're right. If you were to sum up his work, it's going, logic doesn't matter that much. Entertainment counts for an awful lot, and I think he's right. And maybe there's going to be a swing back to that. I hope so, because he is right. Entertainment is, and I wonder if we've got to this situation because there has been more data, there has been more research, things have got more, so people have got more serious, and that seriousness weighs on creative thinking, it weighs on strategic thinking. So you don't tend to get to the completely crazed, the Barnum type approach to promoting things.
Yeah, I think that's an issue with the culture at the clients. They're spending these tens of millions of dollars on advertising, and somebody's got to sign the approval, and they want to have in their back pocket all of the, well, we did the research and the consumers liked it, and we did this and we did that, and this is, and everything has to be very, very logical. And the truth is, a lot of this stuff is gut instinct still. A lot of it, especially in creativity, it's gut instinct. What's going to, tickle somebody's funny bone? What's going to make them?
I think another element of this, and Paul Feldwood talked about this, and that is the reluctance on the part of us in the ad industry to acknowledge that we're taking ourselves too seriously. We're trying to be this serious profession when what we are is entertainers. And that ankles some people the wrong way. They don't want to be seen as, we're just out there writing jingles and making you laugh and trying to entertain you. There's science behind what we do, and please take it seriously. It's like, come on, guys.
It's not perceptually clever. And people want to be seen as clever. Our peer group want to be seen as super clever and super socially aware is the other big theme now. And it's not a recipe for what Feldwick's talking about in terms of entertaining work.
There's nothing worse than advertising that lectures the consumer, and
that's what it does.
Oh,
that's what it does. If you look, like you, Charles, I'm a bit of a golf fan. I've played a little bit of golf. I don't play much anymore, but I love watching it. There's nothing worse on television than a golf ad, because it's all about trajectory and how far you hit the ball, and there's no fun in it. It's just boring. They lecture to you about the features of a golf club or a golf ball or whatever. It's terrible.
The ones I can't stand that drive me mad, but maybe other people like them, are the Rolex ones that come on the PGA guys, where it's basically, and now we will say another portentous word about credibility and the game, the beautiful game. And it's just like, stop stringing random words together slowly. It's just,
the only thing I like about those spots are the old footage of Lee and Jack and Tony Jacklin and all the players.
It's just the copy has just become kind of.
Maybe we should do a Rolex watch copy generator online, and we'll just put in a bunch of pretentious words.
That's a great idea. Have you seen the perfume ad one?
No.
All right, I can't remember the exact link, but there's a very funny site, and basically it's write your own perfume ad, and it's cryingly funny, because actually sometimes you think people have just gone there and lifted one of these paragraphs.
I can see where that would be a fun thing, because perfume ads, like some of these jewelry ads that you see in New York Times and Wall Street Journal, it's just a picture of the jewel and the name of the jeweler, and there's just like, okay.
Yeah, but it's the perfume ones that are funny, because they're always so. I mean, it almost seems as if you have to be ludicrous to be a perfume ad. Right. So yeah, it's worth looking. It's very funny.
I don't know if this is a good time to make the segue, but I'm going to make the segue anyway back to the creative brief. In your years of writing briefs and fostering briefs and working with others who wrote briefs and thinking about briefs, where is your thinking today? It seems to be that the brief is the favorite kicking, the poor second cousin, the favorite punching bag. Everyone loves to hate the brief, and yet it's still an essential part of what we do. What's your take on where we are today with the creative brief?
I'm not sure I have a take on it. I have advice for people, which I think we touched on earlier, which is, firstly, don't develop them on your own. If you're a strategist or whoever you are running the brief, it's your responsibility ultimately to write the damn thing, and to do the research and to understand the client DNA, the brand, the consumer. But then involve people in your thinking, and involve the group that's going to write the ads in the options you're thinking through, to see if you can get further contrarian thoughts around that. Don't operate as an island. And then all of a sudden, when you take the creative teams or the design teams through the brief, they've already seen it. They know what it is. They contributed to it. They're already emotionally invested, which is obviously the trick you need to play with clients as well, which is get their input, not with the finished document, but early on. And it will help you genuinely build it. So that's the kind of advice I would give. And that shouldn't be something that's done by committee. You can't do that. I'm not advocating that, but I am advocating discussion and debate. It's almost when you're in the room. I think a great brief is not just focused and simple and, what is it? It has to be relevant to the audience. It has to be distinctive and fresh, and it has to be true. I mean, those are the three things. You apply that to ads or briefs. If it's those things, that's great. But it's almost when you take it into the room, people should be kind of like, yeah, I know elements of this already. That's great. And the briefing becomes an idea development. It becomes the first round of ideas just to get them out of the system because people have already been involved. But again, that involves time. It involves confidence. It involves, people that walk around an agency and spend time with other departments as opposed to sitting in their corner. So that's where my take on it is. I think the other thing is that, over many years of being involved in briefs, actually the brief I like most are problem briefs, a real understanding of what the problem is. And then you sit down and work out the answer from that. So it's more open-ended. And you don't necessarily end up with an ad from that. So, clients are always complaining about you only bring the ads. So, all right, one way of breaking that is, all right, our brief will be the problem definition, a brilliant problem definition. And then we'll go broad from that. That's a really interesting one. That's tricky. That works very well with older creative people because they get it and they revel in that freedom. Younger folk, because they're just learning how the hell do I get an ad out? That's what I'm worried about. How do I make something? Then a propositional based brief tends to work better with them. It's kind of horses for courses. But yeah.
I'm a man after my own heart.
Yeah. I have a handful of briefs that I use in my training that I've discovered I've gotten my hands on. A number of them from the UK, a couple of them from the United States. They're very hard, and I mean a finished brief, a polished brief and then I have the creative that emerged from that brief. And Henry has seen them because I've included them in my books, and we've talked about some of them on our show. When I go out and I do training, I show these briefs as examples of well-written briefs, and invariably the first question that I get asked is, because these briefs fill one page, 3, 4, maybe 5 questions. I say, what's missing from this brief? And the first is, oh, well, there are no deliverables. What's the ad? They want an ad or a TV spot? It's like, I say, okay, why is there no deliverables? And they are baffled. Why would they not ask for deliverables? Well, it's the creatives in the room who raise their hand and say, well, I don't need to know what the deliverable is. Yeah. I'm just there. I want to come up with the idea. So I love your point about a problem-focused brief as an exercise. We're not going to have a deliverable. We're just going to figure out what the heck is the problem.
Yeah. It might not be an advertisement. Quite often, because it's easy to buy ads. Yeah. If you're a client, the easiest thing.
Reject them.
Well, it's easiest.
No, I think you mean from a media standpoint, right?
Yeah. You've got a problem, you make an ad. Okay, it might be a bit of a fight on the way there, and they may reject good work, but ultimately, you pay some money to the agency, and then the production house, and then the media company. You don't actually change anything in what your company does. You're putting a piece of communication out there, versus going, actually, we can't address this with an ad. We need to change the pricing. We need to redesign the bottle. We need to get into different distribution. Or we could make a far bigger impact in our core sales area by helping the community.
Yeah,
they just it's too hard because they have to see their boss and the CEO, and
I think there's a lot there. Byron Sharp talks about mental and physical availability, and I think that you're right. Like sometimes the problem isn't the mental availability, it's the physical availability, or sometimes it's both. And I think that one of the things that I've noticed is the conflation of advertising and marketing. And advertising is one of the 4 P's of marketing. It's part of one of the 4 P's. It's not even completely the promotion part, right? Because there's public relations and there's other types of promotion beyond just advertising. But I think that there's this conflation between advertising. And I think to your point, it's also easy because you have an agency. When things aren't going well, the agency takes the fall and nobody has to say, well, maybe the product was wrong, or maybe the pricing was wrong, or the distribution was screwed up. It's a lot easier to just, clean sweep and bring in a new shop.
Yeah. I think the ease factor always makes me chuckle as well clients go, you only bring me ads. And I remember dealing with one client I was managing for many years, and I went, okay, shall I show you the hundreds of non-advertising ideas you have ignored in every single creative presentation deck over the last 5 years? Shall I bring them in? And you go, because they sign off on one bit and then the rest is just other PowerPoint charts or other boards leaning against the wall. To the point where I almost stopped doing that. Again, no, the first thing we present is the non-advertising idea.
And
That's
frankly,
all to execute.
And frankly, in a lot of cases, they're only paying the agency to do ads.
Exactly.
That's the expectation.
I think that's another thing that, big change from the, the 50s and 60s was clients weren't marketing experts. They brought in the agencies had marketing departments, and the clients were experts in manufacturing and distribution, and then they hired agencies, and agencies came up with marketing plans and so forth. But they brought all the marketing in-house, and so the agencies just make the advertising. And the other big difference, I think, from that golden age is back then, most big corporations, at least in America, or a lot of them, were privately held companies. And during the 60s, 70s, 80s, everything went publicly held. And now all of a sudden you're responding to quarterly financial reporting. Everything is the bottom line short-termism because of finances. You don't have clients that are like willing to build a brand over decades and just make a gigantic brand because it takes, you have to defer the gratification, right? Like the street wants to have the financial report today. And so I think a lot of that has also adversely affected creativity. Well, I left you speechless.
Yes. Well, Charles Wigley, we are delighted and grateful that you decided to join us today. We appreciate your time, your generous time. And we also appreciate the great thought and wisdom that you embedded into this list of 100 things that is a part of that blog post that caught our attention. We will go back to it, I'm sure, many times beyond this conversation. Thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Good fun, guys.
All right. Take care.
Cheers, then.